Do you have a Bigfoot coffee mug this morning? Because I absolutely do. Yeah, right here. Richard Foster, in his classic book, Streams of Living Water, says this in the introduction. Today, a mighty river of the Spirit is bursting forth from the hearts of women and men, boys and girls. It is a deep river of divine intimacy, a powerful river of holy living, a dancing river of jubilation in the Spirit, and a broad river of unconditional love for all people. As Jesus says, out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water. This phenomenon has been repeated many times throughout the centuries, and the result is that various streams of life, good streams, important streams, have been cut off from the rest of the Christian community, depriving us of a balanced vision of life and faith. And so in our day, God is bringing together a mighty Mississippi of the Spirit. You know, I read this book 20 years ago in my early 20s, and it was just super influential to me. And because of this book, and it's all about the different traditions that we find inside of Christianity and what we can gain and appreciate and value from them. And so some of them I agree with a lot, and some of them I kind of don't agree with, but writers like Richard Foster and Leslie Newbigin in the 1970s and 80s, they taught me about the power of Christian ecumenicism, of engaging in the unity of Christ and not in the brokenness of the world. And because of this, while I disagree with a few things behind the English Standard Version, I've used it almost exclusively the last couple of years. It moved from a translation that I avoided to a translation that I use pretty much more than anything else, even though I've got ones I like a lot better than it. And in many ways, I justify this with the value I've had of my entire adult Christian life of trying to be a wide Christian and not a narrow one. But I think the time has come for me to make a different decision. So this video is about why I'm not using the ESV anymore, but it's also a little bit about the process of Christian discernment and how we make decisions about what is really important to us. I'm Chad Brooks. I'm a pastor here in North Louisiana, and I make videos about the Bible, about the Christian life, and about the everyday life of a pastor. And so today I want to talk about why I am not going to use the English Standard Version after this year. I'm going to do it through three conversations: the good, the sketchy, and the gnarly. So to start off with the good. You know, the English Standard Version is a really solid translation about 90% of the time. If you're looking for a Bible that has a high level of accuracy and is a word-for-word translation, it's pretty much at the top of the list. And while that's not something that's super high in my value set, those sorts of things, for general reading, for sermon preparation, and for most of my Bible reading, it's been a really solid thing to use. But what really shines with the English Standard Version is the additions that Crossways makes. They have almost an exclusive use of the English Standard Version. Some other folks print some higher end ones, but they have some fantastic additions. And a couple of years ago when I started changing how I read scripture and used it, that was something really important to me because they made the only things that seemed to make sense for me. In a lot of ways, I actually kind of learned to adapt to the translation because the additions were just so strong. I wanted a hardback, wide margin Bible right there. Cambridge wide margin hardback. I call it the turkey buzzard. I wanted this, and this format was just absolutely perfect for me. And then I found the scripture journals. These guys right here are just absolutely bad to the bone. It's so cool. I mean, you get one side of this is scripture and the other side is a blank notebook page. And so this gave me what I really wanted. You know, the New Testament Inductive Study Bible was my jam for a while. And so the accessibility of the English Standard Version is fantastic, which is what makes it a really good Bible to use. But let's move over into the sketchy. And this is where we kind of have like the realm of, I can do that. So the first thing is this. The English Standard Version is not necessarily a translation, but it's an intentional revision of the old school Revised Standard Bible. This was kind of the normal, more academic, highly accurate translation you saw all throughout the mid-20th century. And so some translation work was done, and there was a committee of really good, solid biblical scholars that oversaw some of this translation work, but the beginning point was the Revised Standard Version. And I've got an article about this, the whole thing linked down in the description. There's actually several articles linked down in there. I made a video in the past about my 2 favorite rules about Bible translations to break. And one of the things I talked about was understanding how translations came to be and why translations were made, and how I'm pretty weary of a translation that has a really narrow theological viewpoint. Remember what I said earlier in the video about me having this value in my adult Christian life. I want to be a wide Christian and not a narrow Christian. And the English Standard Version has a pretty narrow theological scope. It is a conservative, evangelical, and complementarian translation, and they take those 3 words, pretty seriously. And the thing kind of in question is that word complementarian, and what that means is they believe that there's a natural design to the order that places men above women. And more specifically, they're going to be pretty deliberate in some of the translation choices, especially where Paul is involved, about believing that men only should be in ministry. And as a United Methodist, as a Wesleyan, I find a point of divergence here. Also with Crossways, who publishes these Bibles, Crossways holds that same theological viewpoint as well. And whereas I would call myself conservative-ish, and where I'm not scared to use the word evangelical to describe myself, I'm pretty much on the opposite end of the pendulum swing from the folks that this Bible is marketed to, theologically. And so it's kind of shaky ground for me. One of my foundational viewpoints is this belief that Jesus talks about a level of equality among gender roles. And then also, like I said, as United Methodist, as a theological Wesleyan, supporting women in ministry is a core belief of ours. It's something that has been part of our movement almost since the very beginning. And there's also some differing eschatological interpretations that are part of the translation a little bit, but are super, super prevalent inside of the ESV Study Bible that I just agree with. Now, these are subtle translation issues, but subtle still begins to matter. And so for the longest time, I would just say, I'm willing to deal with these things. I knew where I was theologically. I have a really good grasp of the original languages, of Scripture, of seeing these places, and I read a lot of things that I disagree with. I have no problem with that. In fact, many of my favorite living biblical scholars and biblical theologians are Reformed, and whereas I'm not Reformed, I can easily appreciate, like I said, a wide idea of Christianity. And so for the longest time, I thought, I can deal with this. I can live with that. I can recognize the differences. I can get around it. They're not going to affect me or influence me, because I felt like the additions were so good that I was willing to look over this stuff. But we then step into the gnarly. And I've been wanting to move off the ESV probably for like 6 months. And in those 6 months, I've been hearing from a lot of my friends. They're saying, Chad, we still just can't believe you're using the ESV. And I'm hearing from friends of mine that are women pastors and hearing about their sort of things. And so I start doing some digging around, start doing some researching. And a lot of other folks have thought about this more. But there's been a lot of people who have wrote about the gender politics of the English Standard Version. And it goes beyond just having a divergence in thought about women in ministry and a divergence in thought about like your kind of classic old school, like the husband is to be the leader of his household type thing. But you begin to see that inside of the translation that there's some moves that are going well beyond this viewpoint and really into an unbiblical and an unhealthy view of women in general as part of the English Standard Version and its larger ecosystem. And in fact, if we go back to the Revised Standard Version, which was the beginning point of the text, and open it up in several places and compare the RSV to the ESV, you see that some intentional translation differences were made to keep this idea of a hierarchy between genders just very prevalent inside of this, and it just kind of comes across as having a lower view of women. Beth Alsenbar is a historical writer, and she wrote an article I've linked to down below called Deconstructing the ESV, and she does a fantastic way of explaining what this looks like. And so I'm not going to go deep into this rabbit hole. But it's at this point I began to realize that my own personal theological foundations and convictions meant that I could not support the larger translation philosophy of the English Standard Version. And that's where it's important to understand what our view of Scripture is. Because here's the thing, if you're wanting super dogmatic accuracy in word-for-word translation, even if you might agree with the theological viewpoint that's coming out of this whole Crossways ESV world, what we're seeing is there's evidence that they were making decisions that are not necessarily the most accurate in the translation, instead to support a secondary theological viewpoint. And that's kind of a problem. And so what do we do with the many other scholars and other translators who say in their comments that, like, the original biblical text does not say this. You were saying this to fit your paradigm. Is something truly accurate if it's translated to fit a modern issue? And you can really kind of connect these threads if you go through those articles that are linked down below. So that's why I'm not using English Standard Version anymore. I've got a lot more fun stuff in the pipeline that I'm going to be sharing over the next couple weeks before the end of the year with what I am doing next. All I got to say is the turkey buzzard is still going to be flying. But what I also hope you've seen and heard inside of this is inside of the spirit of being a wide Christian. This doesn't mean universalist. This does not mean going theological willy-nilly all over the place, but it's having what John Wesley would call a Catholic spirit over these things. And you're also hearing, I'm not demonizing the English Standard Version. This is a personal conviction, a personal decision that I've made for myself. I'll tell you what, I'm very thankful for the way that I have grown in Scripture over the last few years because of the Bibles I was using. I'm not going to demonize, I'm going to go burn things to the stake. I'm not going to throw away the whole shelf full of these things that I've been using, but I wanted you to also just kind of see how I was thinking, what I was doing. So I am wildly stoked to share the next couple of videos with you. If you like content like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I love hanging out and talking about Bibles with folks here on YouTube. So I'm Chad Brooks, and I will be back in my next video.